Imagine if the teachings of Jesus that you thought you knew were just the surface of a far deeper and more powerful truth, a truth hidden in plain sight, preserved not in churches or temples, but in ancient manuscripts, mystic traditions, and the quiet whispers of the soul. What if I told you that the most transformative message of Jesus was never about religion, but about awakening? Today we're going to uncover the secret teachings of Jesus, wisdom so profound it has been buried, distorted, or deliberately hidden for centuries. These are the truths passed not to the masses, but to those who had eyes to see and ears to hear. And the final revelation, shared at the end of this journey, is the most powerful of all. It could change everything you think you know about reality, the universe, and your divine purpose. So stay with me, because what you're about to discover has the power to awaken your soul. Before we dive deep, remember to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, comment your thoughts along the way, and share this message with those who are seeking higher truth. The revelations in this video might just shift your entire perception of life and spirit. Let's begin. For most people, the image of Jesus is limited to sermons on morality, healing the sick, and the story of crucifixion. But in the hidden corridors of history, there exists another dimension to his life, a mystical teacher, an initiate of ancient wisdom, a master of divine consciousness, who came not to start a religion but to awaken humanity to its forgotten divinity. These teachings were preserved not in the canonical texts, but in suppressed gospels like those found in Nag Hammadi, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They paint a radically different picture: Jesus, not as a savior asking for worship, but as a guide illuminating the path to inner enlightenment. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." He wasn't speaking of physical immortality, but of liberation from the illusion of separateness and ignorance, the awakening to the eternal self within. This is not doctrine. This is direct experience. This is gnosis. Gnosis, from the Greek, means knowledge, but not book knowledge, experiential, intuitive, divine knowing. And this is the essence of Jesus' hidden message, that the divine does not exist outside of us, but within the stillness of our soul. That the kingdom of heaven is not a place, but a state of consciousness accessible now. Think about that. How different is this from the institutionalized version of Christianity that has dominated for the last 2,000 years, where guilt replaced grace, fear replaced freedom, and power replaced presence? Renowned scholar Elaine Pagels, a professor of religion at Princeton University and expert on the Gnostic texts, suggests that these hidden teachings reflect a Jesus who empowers the individual, who teaches that salvation is not achieved by blind faith, but by awakening the light within. And this light is precisely what the ancient mystics, the Essenes, and the Hermetic sages spoke of. Many historians believe Jesus was connected to the Essenes, a mystical Jewish sect that lived near Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Essenes practiced deep meditation, sacred rituals, and believed in purification of body, mind, and soul to commune with divine energies. This aligns closely with the deeper teachings of Jesus on inner transformation, silence, and the cultivation of spiritual vision. In fact, in Matthew 6:22, Jesus says, "If your eye be single, your whole body will be full of light." This cryptic phrase has been interpreted by mystics for centuries as a reference to the pineal gland, the third eye, a gateway to divine perception, long honored in Egyptian, Vedic, and Hermetic traditions. Could Jesus have been referring not merely to ethical behavior, but to awakening our inner faculties of divine sight? And if so, why has this been ignored for centuries? Because power structures have always feared self-realization. A population that knows its inner divinity is a population that cannot be controlled. When you awaken to your own light, you no longer need intermediaries, institutions, or external validation. You realize you are not separate from the source. You are the expression of the divine. This is the radical core of Jesus' secret message, and it terrified the ruling elites of both his time and centuries after. That's why the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, under Emperor Constantine, worked to consolidate the Christian message, suppressing gospels that emphasized personal awakening, feminine wisdom, and spiritual initiation. But the truth never dies. It continues to whisper to those who seek, to those like you. Have you ever felt that strange pull? That the teachings you were given as a child only scratched the surface? That there was something deeper, something ancient calling to your soul? You're not alone. There's a reason you're here. This lost wisdom has waited for the right moment to re-emerge, not to create another religion, but to spark a revolution of consciousness. And now, in this age of spiritual awakening, the veil is lifting. So ask yourself, what if the teachings of Jesus were not meant to be worshipped, but lived? What if salvation is not about waiting to die, but awakening while alive? And what if the true kingdom of heaven is already within you, waiting only for you to see it? We've only just begun to peel back the layers. In the next part, we will dive into the sacred feminine that was buried alongside these teachings and the real role of Mary Magdalene, not as a sinner, but as a spiritual equal and initiate. The truth may shock you. Let me know in the comments. What stirred your soul in this first revelation? What have you always suspected, but were told to doubt? The story you were told about Mary Magdalene is incomplete, perhaps deliberately so. She was not a prostitute. She was not an accessory in the shadow of the 12 male disciples. She was, according to many ancient sources, the closest initiate to Jesus, a woman who understood his secret teachings at a level deeper than any of the others. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, a text discovered in the late 19th century and dated to the 2nd century, we find an extraordinary scene. The disciples are confused and frightened after the crucifixion. It is Mary who stands and encourages them with wisdom and clarity. It is Mary who speaks of Jesus' true message, not of sin and sacrifice, but of the ascent of the soul and the liberation from illusion. Peter, in this text, grows jealous of her closeness to the Master. And Mary replies with something powerful, "I am not lying, he spoke with me in a vision." Why were these words buried? Because they revealed something dangerous, that Jesus saw women not as subordinates, but as spiritual equals. That enlightenment was not restricted by gender, status, or tradition, that the deepest mysteries were not for the elite, but for the awakened heart. This sacred balance between masculine and feminine, between logic and intuition, structure and flow, wisdom and compassion, was central in many ancient spiritual systems. The Taoists called it yin and yang. The Kabbalists saw it in the tree of life. The Egyptians honored it in Isis and Osiris. And Jesus, as a master of divine harmony, embodied this too. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's role is symbolic of a larger suppression, the erasure of the divine feminine from spirituality. When the feminine principle is cast aside, spirituality becomes rigid, hierarchical, disconnected from the intuitive. It becomes law without love, dogma without soul. But when the divine feminine is restored, something miraculous happens. We begin to see not with fear but with clarity, not with judgment but with understanding. We remember. Mary Magdalene represents not only a historical figure, but a spiritual archetype, the inner feminine voice within all of us that calls us back to intuition, to sacred wisdom, to the path of inner knowing. And what was this secret knowledge that Jesus shared with her? It wasn't about blind obedience or external rituals. It was about the soul's journey through the realms of illusion. In the Gospel of Mary, Jesus teaches that the soul after death must pass through multiple realms, each representing attachments, ignorance, and false beliefs. Only by letting go and remembering its divine origin can the soul ascend to full liberation. This is not unlike the teachings of the ancient Egyptians, who believed the soul passed through tests after death, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which describes the Bardo states, or the Hermetic writings, which speak of the soul's return to the divine mind through purification and gnosis. These are not mere metaphors, they are maps, spiritual blueprints left by awakened beings to guide those ready to walk the path of return. And Jesus, through Mary Magdalene and through his private teachings, was offering this same path. But why only to a few? Because not everyone was ready. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "I disclose my mysteries to those who are worthy of my mysteries." This doesn't mean elitism, it means preparedness. The mysteries of the soul cannot be forced, they must be unveiled by inner readiness, humility, and longing for truth. And perhaps that's why you're still here, because some part of you has always known there is more, something beyond doctrine and dogma, something luminous, eternal, and profoundly real. This journey is not just about Jesus. It's about you. You are the seeker, the mystic, the Magdalene. The secret teachings of Jesus were meant not to create separation, but unity, not to enslave minds, but to liberate souls. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, another early Christian text, we hear Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man, not to denote superiority, but to reveal a deeper mystery, that the Christ is not a person, but a state of consciousness accessible to every human being. This is the true meaning of Christ in you, the hope of glory, as Paul wrote. This is the mystery hidden for generations. You are not separate from God. The veil between you and the divine is thinner than a breath. And when you begin to remember, not just intellectually but experientially, that you are the living temple, the carrier of divine light, everything changes. Fear dissolves, dogma fades, and love, real, radiant, infinite love, awakens at the center of your being. But we've only begun to understand the layers of this mystery. In the next part, we will explore the connection between Jesus and the ancient wisdom schools of Egypt, India, and Greece. We'll uncover hidden parallels with the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the Vedantic sages, and even the Buddha. These connections reveal something astonishing, that Jesus was not isolated, but part of a timeless stream of enlightened wisdom that flows through all true spiritual traditions. You won't want to miss it. So now I ask you, do you believe Mary Magdalene was just a witness, or was she the keeper of the Master's most sacred truths? And if the divine feminine is rising once again, what does that awaken within you? Share your thoughts in the comments. The ancient world was a web of spiritual knowledge, connected not by geography, but by vibration, by truth. The idea that Jesus was part of a larger current of sacred wisdom is not a theory, it's a rediscovery. To understand his hidden teachings, we must look beyond the familiar stories and into the mystery schools of antiquity. What if Jesus, before beginning his public ministry, spent years immersed in the esoteric traditions of Egypt, India, and Greece? What if he studied not just the Torah, but the emerald tablets of Thoth, the Vedas, and the teachings of the Buddha? Though the canonical Gospels are silent about his early life, ancient legends and non-canonical texts suggest a different narrative. In Egypt, he could have encountered the Hermetic teachings, wisdom attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical fusion of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek Hermes. Hermes taught that all things are one, that the universe is a reflection of the divine mind, and that by knowing ourselves we come to know the cosmos. This echoes precisely what Jesus taught. Know thyself, and you shall know the kingdom of God. The Hermetic principle, as above, so below, lives within Jesus' teachings of the Father and the kingdom, mirroring the divine within. He wasn't introducing something entirely new, he was reviving and embodying a timeless truth. Further east, ancient texts from India, such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, speak of the Atman, the inner self, as one with Brahman, the absolute divine. This is eerily similar to Jesus' message, I and the Father are one. In both traditions we find the same core message. Divine union is the goal, and it is achieved through awakening, not belief alone. There are even oral traditions in parts of India and Nepal that speak of Isa, a holy man from the West who lived and studied among Buddhist monks and Vedic mystics. In the Hemis monastery in Ladakh, documents reportedly describe this traveler as a compassionate teacher who challenged the rigid caste system and taught about inner divinity. Could this have been Jesus? Theologians like Edgar Cayce, the American mystic known as the Sleeping Prophet, spoke often of Jesus' hidden years. He claimed Jesus traveled to Egypt, Persia, and India, absorbing the sacred teachings and preparing himself for his mission, not merely as a moral reformer, but as a bringer of cosmic light. And there's more. In Greece, centuries before Jesus, Pythagoras had already revealed that numbers, sound, and geometry held divine significance. He spoke of the transmigration of the soul and the sacred harmony of the universe. Plato, his philosophical descendant, wrote of the world soul and the realm of eternal forms, the perfect spiritual templates behind physical reality. Jesus' teachings often reflect this Platonic perspective. In his parables, he urges listeners to look beyond the material and see the deeper symbolic truths. He invites us to awaken not through logic alone, but through the heart, through inner realization. He teaches not a new religion, but a universal remembrance, a return to source. In the Gospel of Philip, another text suppressed by institutional authorities, we read something extraordinary. Truth did not come into the world naked, but in types and images. The world will not receive truth in any other way. This means that Jesus' words were cloaked in symbols, parables, metaphors, stories that concealed layers of meaning only accessible to the awakened. The crucifixion, then, was not only a historical event, it was a mystical drama. It symbolized the death of the ego, the surrender of the false self, and the resurrection of divine consciousness. The cross is not just wood, it is the intersection of the earthly and the divine, of time and eternity. And the resurrection is not just Jesus's, it is the destiny of every soul who awakens. When you let the false die within you, something miraculous begins. The real you is reborn. Do you see now why these teachings were feared? They do not ask for worship. They demand transformation. They do not require obedience. They require awakening. And once a soul has tasted the truth of its own divinity, it can no longer be enslaved by fear. Even today, institutions resist this awakening. Systems built on external control lose their power when you realize you are your own temple, your own priest, your own sacred flame. This is the Jesus that was hidden, the teacher of the way, the embodiment of Christ consciousness, the revealer of inner divinity. And here is the mystery. Christ was never meant to be confined to one man, one church, or one book. The Christ is within you, waiting to awaken as you. This is what the mystics knew. This is what the Gnostics were killed for. And this is what you are now being invited to remember. But there is one more veil to lift, one final revelation that brings all of this together. In the next part, we will uncover the ultimate secret, the final message that Jesus gave in silence, known only to the inner circle, a teaching that transcends words, religion, and time, a truth that could awaken your deepest power and return you fully to the source of all life. This is not the end. It is the beginning of your own spiritual resurrection. So reflect now. What ancient wisdom speaks to your soul the loudest? Egypt, India, Greece? And can you feel the threads connecting them, not as fragments, but as a unified stream of divine remembrance? Share your thoughts, your intuition, your questions. There is a moment in every seeker's journey when words are no longer enough, when the scriptures fade into silence, and only one voice remains, the one within. This is where the final teaching of Jesus lives. It was never written in any gospel, spoken from any pulpit, or taught in any temple. It is the unspeakable truth he whispered in silence to the ones who were truly ready, not because it was secret to exclude, but because it was sacred, too vast for language, too luminous for doctrine. But today you are ready. The final teaching is this: you are not separate from God. You never were. Everything, your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts, your dreams, is a ripple of the divine. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, then shall you enter the kingdom." This is not poetry. This is the ultimate key. It means that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go to after death. It is a dimension of consciousness you awaken to while alive. When you dissolve the illusion of duality, of self and other, of God and man, of sacred and secular, you return to the oneness that has always been. This is what the mystics called unio mystica, the merging of the soul with the infinite. The Buddhists called it nirvana. The Hindus called it moksha. The Hermetic sages called it the great work. And Jesus called it simply the kingdom of God within. Everything he taught, everything he endured, every word and silence was pointing to this one truth, that you are already whole. You are already divine. The veil of separation is the great illusion, and the moment you awaken from it, the game ends. The soul returns home. This truth is not something you must strive for. It's something you must remember. That is why his last words, according to some mystical interpretations, were not just "it is finished," but a deep mystical declaration. The illusion has ended. The veil is torn. The divine is revealed within you. And do you remember the veil in the temple? How it was torn from top to bottom when he died? This wasn't just a physical event. It was a cosmic symbol. The veil that separated God from humanity Spirit from matter was torn forever. The inner temple was revealed. And it was not made of stone, it was made of you. You are the holy place, you are the living gospel. You are the mirror in which God sees God. This is the sacred fire hidden in the center of all traditions. The light that has never gone out, even as centuries of distortion tried to bury it. But now it is rising again in you and in countless others who are hearing the call to awaken. So what now? You have heard the lost teachings. You have seen how the divine feminine was suppressed and is now rising. You have glimpsed how ancient wisdom from Egypt, India, Greece, and beyond converge into a single stream of living truth. And now you know, the deepest teaching of Jesus was never about belief. It was about being. It was about becoming so silent within, so open, so surrendered, that the divine presence pours into you, not as something foreign, but as your truest self. So I ask you now, can you feel it? Can you feel the stillness behind your thoughts, the sacred breath moving through you, the presence that has always waited for you to notice? That is the Christ within. It is not a title, not a doctrine. It is a state of consciousness, one of love, clarity, unity, and light. And it is your birthright. You don't need permission to awaken. You don't need to earn your divinity. You only need to remember. And remembering begins with silence. So after this video, take a few moments, sit, breathe, place your hand over your heart and say inwardly, I am that I am. Let that echo in your being. Let it open something ancient inside you. Let it burn away the false and reveal what has always been true. Because this is not the end. This is the beginning of the way, the path Jesus truly walked. A path not of worship, but of embodiment, not of fear, but of freedom, not of waiting to die, but of learning how to truly live. He came not to be admired, but to be mirrored. He came to show us not who he was, but who we are. So now I leave you with this. You are divine. You are eternal. You are the living light of the one source, made manifest in human form, here not to obey, but to awaken, not to conform, but to transform, not to worship the path, but to walk it. If this message touched something in your soul, speak it aloud in the comments. Let your voice join the rising tide of awakened hearts around the world. Share this video with someone who is ready, and if you haven't already, subscribe and walk with us as we continue to uncover the truths that have been hidden for too long. The journey doesn't end here. It begins within you, and it begins now. Thanks for looking.